Hey, friends. That was weak. No, I don't. No. Stop, don't. Oh, that was totally unscripted and spontaneous applause. That was so special. It just makes me feel so welcome here at this non-Microsoft unfriendly conference. Cool. All right, yeah. So my name is Scott. And if you go into incognito mode and Google for Scott, there is an epic battle between Scott toilet paper, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and me. Now, clearly F. Scott Fitzgerald is more important than I am, even though the F is a little bit dodgy. But Scott toilet tissue, it's just completely unacceptable. They've actually put a restricted trademark on the name Scott, which is just total crap. So no matter what you think of .NET, when you review this on your Tumblr or whatever the young people are using these days, make sure to be like, yeah, I saw this great talk, some random dude from Microsoft named href Scott, and then link to my blog, because I need the juice, you guys. I need the Google juice, because I'm on the first page if you Google for Scott. And twitter.com/Scott will not give it up. So I'm Hanselman on Twitter, which sucks. I don't know about Scott Archery, but there's no reason for me to be the last Scott on the page here. So anything you can do to help me out would be fab. Thank you. Pay for it? I don't want to be like ad. It's cheap. I don't want to be that guy. Okay, cool. Advertisement. I have a podcast, and it's really awesome, and you should watch it and listen to it. It is non-denominational. It's not a Microsoft podcast, and it'll be around for a very long time afterwards. 575 episodes. It used to be about programming, and now it's just about awesome stuff. So this woman is actually renewing a dead Caribbean language. So bringing it back to life. She's a PhD in linguistics. This woman here did the UI pattern library in SAS for Hillary Clinton's website, so the pattern language for that. This mob programming with Woody Zuhl, super cool. Just this is a pile. Lovey did a New York Times bestselling author. This guy here had the idea to port MAME, the multi-arcade machine emulator, to JavaScript and put it on the web. So just super epic people. You need another podcast in your life. One of the great things about this podcast is that it's 30 minutes long, it's time-bound, and I don't ask them about the weather or how they're doing, which saves you 20 minutes, because all the other podcasts are two dudes on Skype. Hey, what's going on? What'd you do this weekend? None of that. Straight to the hard questions. So check it out. All right, cool. So let's think about how to do this. There are a couple different .NETs. Let me do that. I'm going to show you one slide. I know it's bad to have any slides at all, but a contextual slide would be helpful. And then we'll spend the rest of the time, hopefully, at the command line. And maybe I can have some secret internal slides that no one should. That looks like that's internal in NDA. Any slides that I open, I have to give him, so that's concerning. I'm like, what do I want to, crap. See, I didn't mean for this to be hunting for slides, but I knew that folder is empty. That folder is not empty. That folder is, oh, that's comforting. All right. Is it really, though? That's not really useful, though. There you go. That's a good one. Is this NDA? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, this has some value. Let me show you this for a second. Seriously, it does have value. Article about Microsoft open sourcing .NET. Notice the date. I will zoom in because a small screen. Do you know that we've open sourced .NET 4 times? Yeah. It was kind of a stupid attempt to open source. But this is before Git. This is during when open source was much more FOSS than OS. When they open sourced it, they took out the jitter, the just-in-time compiler, they took out the garbage collector, and they put in naive implementations, and then left the rest as an exercise to their reader. And they thought that people would use it in schools. And they called it the shared source license, and it was totally stupid. Then they did it again, and they released .NET under the Microsoft reference license, which was basically MIT plus a sentence. And then they realized that that's also stupid. So then they just released everything under MIT. And I think we go either MIT or Apache right now. So everything's very friendly, and we figured it out. It just took a while. But people think that, like, oh, they must have open sourced .NET because of the new boss. We've been doing this for 15 years. We've just been doing it poorly. So now, see, the thing is, Microsoft isn't nearly as organized as it would need to be as evil as you think it is. I guess we didn't open source .NET today. That's .NET in 2015. So this is GitHub contributions, pull requests, and stuff like that. This is 2016. And if I include all kinds of contributions, it looks like this. So we basically took the GitHub API, the data set, pulled out pull requests, issues, comments, reverse, looked at their location. If they had an IP address, figured it out. If they didn't, some people are on boats working really hard on open source. But for the most part, okay. So here's the context. When you hear .NET, I'm thinking of you as like the .NET people. I don't know why you all stayed on this side of the dance floor, and these are the non-.NET people. So when y'all think of .NET, you think of it works on Windows. You write Windows apps with it. It's big. It's giant. It's scary. It usually gets updated randomly with Windows Update, and you just generally live in fear of it. And it has a nonsensical versioning scheme. Is that probably fair? Okay, cool. That .NET lives in C:\Windows/Microsoft.NET. And in the old days, you would go and download the .NET runtime, and it would be like a gig, and it would be scary, and it would cause a reboot. And there became a time when you would only ever get that .NET if you had to. Right? Like, oh, I have to, my dad would be like, I gotta get .NET. I'm like, oh, you're interested in programming. He's like, no, I want to run paint.NET. And it says that's a prerequisite, right? Then this changed, and now you just get .NET with Windows. It's just part of Windows. So it is literally, you get a new version of Windows, you get a new version of .NET. If you have Windows 10, I think you have .NET 4.6, and that's just what happens. Okay? There is that .NET. What there really are, though, are 3 instances of .NET. If you think about .NET as like Java, like it's a marketing term. So there are multiple JVMs, multiple instances of the JVM. There's the one from Sun. There are alternative JVMs or flavors. The .NET framework that we think of is the one that comes with Windows. There are others. There is Mono, which is a clean room implementation of .NET. And this is really important. Mono, they literally looked at .NET as a black box, realizing that there were, at the time, legal and patent minefields within it, and said, we're not going to look at the source. It was available, but they chose not to look at it. And they said, we're going to look at the shape of this and treat the .NET surface area as an interface. And then we will then implement that interface. So strings look like this, and they have length, and they have .compare, et cetera. We will go and implement the same behavior on their own. So it is a complete re-implementation of this. So this is bringing everything that isn't Windows specific over to anywhere. So it's a portable re-implementation. This is both good and bad. It's good because the code is completely clean room. It's their own jitter. It's their own everything. It's bad because it's a complete duplication of stuff that they don't need to be duplicating. Okay? But it powered Xamarin, and it allows things that .NET doesn't do. We'll talk about how these things get reconciled in a second. And I will try to get off the slides, but this is context that doesn't fit in a tweet. And this is why I appreciate you all paying attention and appreciating this, because, oh, what the hell is Microsoft doing with .NET? Well, it takes more than 140 characters to explain it. It takes exactly as much time as we have today. .NET Core is a brand new version of .NET that is pared down to its core. All the stuff that we learned about doing cross-platform from things like Silverlight, we're getting it to run on phones, is brought into this. It is much smaller, and it lives in a different location. These are all instances of .NET. Ubuntu in a minute, so just bear with me. All of these concepts, everything that I'm going to talk about is going to be .NET Core, and it works anywhere. So Raspberry Pi, Ubuntu, Mac, whatever makes you happy. 12 flavors of Linux. Okay. If I go to cprogramfiles.net, there's this .NET.exe that's sitting right here. And if I go out to some command line, pick your favorite command line, and I type .NET version, it pops out a version number. If I say .NET info, it tells me about my system and the hash of where that came from on GitHub. And if I type where.net, it tells me this. This is a non-version specific .NET. Okay? But .NET needs to be side by side. So just like things like RBM for Ruby environment, or RVM, or NVM, or all the different things that we use to manage multiple versions of stuff, whether it be Java and how we do that. .NET's built that concept in right off the bat. So when you type .NET.exe, that is a driver. It's not really a device driver, but it's a driver that then figures out what the right version of .NET is to get. And you want to uninstall it, you delete the folder. Like, that's literally how easy it is. It's not no reboots, no Windows folder. It just lives in user local bin, whatever. Okay? So that means that I could have two folders, foo and bar, and they could each use entirely different versions of the .NET framework. I could go into foo and type .NET run, and it'll run. I can go into bar and type the same .NET run, and it'll run in a different version. It's the driver that then figures out which one it is to do. Does that make sense? So let's do some of that. So here I am on Windows. I always name folders weird stuff, so then if I see anything weird on my desktop, I know if I should delete it or not. So I'm going to just say .NET new. Actually, I'll just do .NET new. These are all the different .NET news that I can do. This is the same as going file new project in Visual Studio, but I think it's really important to do things at the command line so that you understand what's happening when you go file new project. And plus, there are command line people and there are not command line people. So if I say .NET new console, I get this. Okay, I get a program and I get a CS proj. If we go and open up, actually not cat, there's our program, nothing fancy there. And then let's look at our CS proj. CS proj is a C# project. It used to be JSON, and we went back and forth, but we ended up going back to XML to make sure it works everywhere, and we'll talk about that. But this .NET has compatibility with all of the previous versions of .NET, and that's a good thing, and I'll explain it in a minute. But it's pretty obviously human readable. This is a .NET Core app. It outputs an exe, and it uses the .NET SDK. You don't need to do anything with it, and there's commands for you to deal with it. Now, just like you type npm install, or gem install, or bundle install, or whatever, you type .NET restore, and that goes and gets the packages that you need from a place called NuGet. NuGet is our gems. It's our npm, the Microsoft side. But it's important to point out, though, that that's just for our server-side stuff. So if I were making a React application in .NET, or if I was doing an Angular application in .NET, I'd get my .NET libraries from NuGet, and I get my CSS and my JavaScript from, maybe from Bower or whatever, and I get my npm tools from npm, et cetera, et cetera. So this is one package manager that plays along with others. And that CS proj file can enlist other package managers. So you could say, when you type .NET restore, make sure you go to npm and get this. Make sure you go to Bower and get that. So you can enlist other applications. So I just said .NET restore, and I got this folder here, obj, that just basically brought down the libraries that I need. And I say .NET run, and then the application gets compiled and run. Okay? Nothing fancy. I could go and open that up, and I could go and say console. I can't type when you all are looking at me. Console.readline, just to make it, I'm going to pause and wait for an enter key, right? And then I'll just say .NET run again. Okay? So it'll just run, and the compile step is just happening. Okay? But notice that it's sitting there. It's waiting. So I could then go to like Task Manager and go and click on looking for .NET. You can see that there's actually a couple different .NETs. Now this is a little bit more information than you need, but you all look like a very smart crowd. These are the .NETs that live in Windows, but I also am running Ubuntu because you know that Windows 10 runs Ubuntu now natively. Those are Ubuntu processes. When I switch over there, I'll show you those .NETs that are running elsewhere. And this is not running in a virtual machine. This is native Ubuntu running on Windows. It's all built in now. This makes it really easy to do cross-platform. Why are there two? Well, one of them was the .NET driver that we talked about. And then it looked around and said, oh, here's the version we need. And then it jumped over to the next one. That's why there's two. And if I go and get rid of it, two of them went away. The one is very small. All right. Now, if I go over to Ubuntu, this is 1604. Okay. You can see .NET did some stuff there on the right. See? .NET run, and then .NET shelled out to other stuff. Point is, the experience is exactly the same. All right. It works in both instances. One of the things that is cool, though, that we can potentially do here is stuff that wasn't easy or possible with .NET before. So let's try this. Let's try super testing demo. Wrong super. All right. So empty folder. Trying to figure out a way to do this. Like that's too small and that's too big. So there's just someone's going to lose. Let me see if I can do all this from memory. This is all stuff you could do in Visual Studio, but I want to point out that you can have an entirely productive and happy .NET development life without ever using Visual Studio. You could do it in Notepad or Vim or whatever makes you happy. It is totally non-denominational now. So if I say .NET new, I can make a bunch of different stuff, including a solution file. So .NET new SLN is this solution file. A solution file is a bunch of projects, okay? Then I make a folder, maybe I'll call it library, and I'll make a folder and I'll call it like tests, okay? And I'll go into library, it's empty. I'll say .NET new library. It's just a class. Right now it's empty. And then I might go over to test and say .NET new. And there's different testing harnesses you can make. There's NUnit and XUnit and this unit and that unit and all that kind of crap. Now, this project that I just made has an assertion, a test up here. But it doesn't have a reference to that library. Okay? So in Visual Studio, this is where you have like multiple projects and a solution, and you right-click on one and you say add reference and you point it back to the other. And that's cool. But you need to be able to do all those things in a cross-platform way. So let me see if I know how to do that. You say .NET add, and you can always, with all things, go like -- help. So I can say add reference And I can go up to library. So I've added a reference from the testing thing over to the library. Now remember those csproj files. They're human readable, but you never need to edit them manually, okay? You want to avoid it. I'll do some manual editing just to show you, but you don't necessarily need to be messing around in there. So I added a reference to that project. There's a project reference, which is referencing some source code. And then there's a package reference, which is just like your packages.json. That's all in one place. In previous versions of .NET, for the .NET people, there was like your package config and your csproj, and it's spread all over the place. It's all unified, and it's all very similar. So if you're a Ruby person or a Node person, all of this should be very comfortable. The concepts are very similar. Okay? So then I should be able to, and let's see if this works, .NET restore. So there you go. That's asking me which project you want to restore. I can restore the library packages. I can restore the test packages. I could also pass in a glob and then restore them all. And I should be able to go down to the testing library and say .NET test, not .NET run, but .NET test. And it goes and it starts this build. And then it starts executing the tests. It sees one test and it passes one test. Now I haven't done anything yet. I haven't actually asserted anything. But this act of edit some code, do a build, do a test, edit some code, do a build, do a test, Microsoft people call this the developer's inner loop, right? It's just all that kind of administrivia that makes your life suck, right? So what do we try to do? Well, we want automated tests, and we want it to like watch the files getting changed and do all that kind of stuff. But a lot of times that's been built into the IDE, and it's been done as magic. So we want to come to a whole new open source world. We want those things to not be magic. So what we'll do is we're going to go and use a tool. We can have all these different tools that are like NPM tools. I'm going to use one called .NET Watch, and I'll show you what this line is. Just as we had project references and package references, I'm going to go and open up this project here. Right, so here's a reference to a unit testing thing, and here's that project reference. That's the one that we did before, right? I'm going to get a tool reference. I want a tool that's going to watch my source code, and if it sees it change, recompile and run again. So we'll have another group, and this is going to be a .NET command line tool called .NET Watcher. And then when you make a change, when you add a library, if you change your package.json in NPM universe, right, then you would go and do a restore. This is the NPM restore. So now I can type .NET test, which we saw before, and it'll run the test, and then it'll exit. Or I can say .NET watch test, and I can chain commands. So now it starts the build, starts the testing. I've got a little ANSI bug here in my console, unrelated. It says waiting for a file to change. So we can go to, is it Super Fancy Pants? Oh, that was super something else. Okay, so here I've got my code in Notepad, and I could say assert dot equal for 2 plus 3, and then just hit save. And I hit save, and the watcher saw it change, and then immediately kicks it off, and then fails the test. Right? So that's the kind of experience that you want to have, and that's something that works everywhere. So if I switch over, for example, to, I think I've got an Ubuntu around here somewhere. Got too many Ubuntus. Same thing over in Ubuntu land, where I've got that same watcher. And I can go and chain. Sorry. And then at this point, you know, split out. Right? Recover my swap file because I don't know what state things are in. Man, who even knows, man? There we go. Right? And then come in here, make some change. Sorry. My Vim is rusty. Oh, God. What are you doing, Vim? Help me. Help me. Oh, for God's sake. I always feel like a failure when I go to visual mode and I'm like, okay, screw it, just click, right? Like, I know that a really good person would type a regular expression to just get to that for, but I'm just going to go and I'm not that guy. And then you go and say write, and then the watch kicks out, and then it starts again. Okay? So in this case, I'm on, and this is important now. This is a little bit of Windows nuance, but this is Ubuntu running on Windows 10. Like I said, if you didn't know, we do that now. That's another universe, right? So it's another file system. It's another instance of .NET. But it's the same exact commands, it's the same exact code, it's the same exact stuff. So that library that I brought in, that .NET Watch, that's the same library I use on Windows. So I'm able to go and do stuff like here where I'm in Tmux and I've got Vim over here and I've got whatever over here. And it works just fine. This allows you to do some interesting stuff then because we've extended .NET in some unusual ways. I can come out here and let's go and say fancy React. That new, when we said .NET new, is extensible. So I can say .NET new. Some of these things came out of the box and include C# and F#. We'll talk about some of the language stuff in a minute. Other things were added later. So you could have .NET new, my company's new, you know, our standard group new that we all decided on. But this is cool as I can go and say .NET new React. And now it's made a React app. It's got Webpack. It's got all the stuff you expect to have. It's set up Babel and git ignore for you. It's using TypeScript if you want. And it's got a back end written in .NET. Okay? And I'm doing this on Ubuntu just to make the point because I don't have a Mac lying around right now. Then I can say .NET restore. Let's go and look at the project file to see what a web app looks like and see whether a web app is more complicated or less so than a hello world application. Let's look at fancy React. So here is like a real app, a little more complicated. So this is the project file. It's got your package references and stuff. But look at these. Run Webpack, you know, after you're going and do your publish. Run npm install. Run Node if you need to. We actually have Node services now. So if you want to solve like the Node first compile problem, first page load problem where you hit a website and you don't want to send your templates down and then have that flash, you want to have them done on the back end. ASP.NET will actually shell out to Node, compile your templates, do the binding on the server side, and then send the compiled stuff across and then go from there. So you can have the best of .NET and the best of Node, which is kind of cool. That's called Node services. So then I can say .NET run. Now, even though I'm in Ubuntu, because they're sharing the same machine, the localhost :3000 or localhost 5000 that this starts up, localhost 5000, is accessible to me anywhere. So I can go and jump into Chrome. So I'm on Chrome on Windows now. And I hit localhost 5000. You can see the logging is happening over here in Ubuntu. but now it's appeared over here. So then I've got a little basic application. And if I want to go and do stuff like fetch data, the back end for this is ASP.NET bringing back JSON. And this gets into some interesting stuff, like why would you use this versus Node? You would use it because it feeds your spirit and makes you happy. You would use it because you like React, or you like Angular, or you like Aurelia, or whatever, but you're also a .NET shop, or you're thinking about using .NET. We'll also talk about some of the performance benefits, because .NET right now on the Tech Empower benchmarks, if you're familiar with those benchmarks, is between 6 and 8 times faster than Node. So you've got a different environment, right? Node is more single-threaded, and you fire up multiple processes if you're going to do things, while .NET is very, very internally multi-threaded. It's got a very sophisticated 64-bit jitter. So you can have the best of both worlds, and when you add in something like TypeScript, something like this weather forecast becomes rather interesting. So let's look, if I've got that open. The other thing I can do when I go back and forth between working on Linux and working on Windows is I can use different editors. I might use Vim, but I might also go and use Visual Studio Code, which is free. So here, it's kind of a weird environment, but this is more common than you'd think. I've got Visual Studio Code, which is my editor. I'm maybe testing in Chrome on Windows, and I've got the whole thing running, though, under Linux, because maybe my ultimate test machine will be Linux, or I'll be putting it in a Docker container, maybe. Okay? So this React application, let me zoom in here, has some data that we're pulling back. This is sample data, okay? Hope I'm making these fonts big enough. So for example, that weather forecast right there starts on line 17. This is what an HTTP GET looks like in ASP.NET. So it's hitting, /API/weather forecast, and it's going to go and randomly select a range, pull out a number of weather forecasts, and then send a projection of weather forecasts out, and then it's randomizing those weather forecasts. And the object, that weather forecast object, looks like that. So that's the C# representation of what the weather forecast object looks like, okay? But the front end is React, and the front end thinks about things in terms of JavaScript, and the front end is TypeScript, right? Notice, though, that there's nothing here that says turn it into JSON or serialize into JSON or make JSON or anything like that. That's all automatic. It knows you are returning a list or an enumerable list, a forward-only enumerable list of weather forecasts, and it's going to assume JSON unless you say otherwise. You can serialize it however you want. And it'll follow RESTful protocols. So for example, if I was returning a list of people and I passed in, well, I only accept vCards, it's not going to return JSON. It's going to look for a vCard formatter and try to serialize a person into a vCard. Or if you only returned like PNGs, it would look for like a photograph of that person and then try to send that, right? So it tries to follow RESTful things. So it's kind of like .NET on nails a little bit, but just a little bit less wasabi or whatever he calls it. If I go down into the client side, though, and look at the fetch data, this is on the client side, and this is TypeScript. There we go. These squiggles right here are squiggled out because it's downloading npm install and getting all of the stuff it needs to go and figure those things out, and it hasn't happened yet. You notice the fetch up here, API sample data, and then it just brings that JSON out of the response. Got serialized automatically, so that you move very seamlessly from C# to JavaScript. You kind of get the benefits of strong typing everywhere. And then because this is TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript, there's actually an interface down here that describes the shape of a weather forecast. And remember that that weather forecast in C# had a computed property. Remember that computed property? Let's go back. date formatted, temperature C, summary, and temperature F, right? This happens on the server side, that conversion. So then when we go back over to our fetch data, by the time it gets here, of course, it's already computed, so that doesn't include that. So the serialization pulls out of that read-only property, and you end up with a nice forecast table that then gets rendered the way that you ordinarily render stuff. So we've gone out of our way to try to make it so whatever model makes you happy, .NET will kind of go in there. People are always asking, like, well, what's Microsoft's prescription? Where's the Microsoft official JavaScript library? That in the past has and will always continue to cause Microsoft to lose, right? For us to assume that we're the smartest people in the room is stupid. So we figured the answer is let the internet decide. Like, makes sense, right? Duh, yeah, duh. Yeah, that's why I went there. And there's a lot of like-minded people like me, some of them are here as well at this conference, that think similarly. That's why we have, containers running in Kubernetes on Azure. It's just whatever makes you happy. The realization that reality is a hybrid, and that I can have an iPhone and a Windows phone and run Linux, and it's okay, and I do it simply because it makes me happy and makes me feel productive, is the model. So this means that someone can go and get Visual Studio and file a new project and never see any of this crap, never see any of the command line. Or they could go on Ubuntu and they could download Visual Studio Code and they could have a great experience and they could use every flavor of every tool that they wanted to. And they could have .NET running on Windows, talking to Redis, running on Linux, and da-da-da-da-da. And sometimes Microsoft will make money, and sometimes they won't. The dirty little secret about Microsoft right now is, what are they selling? Xboxes, Office, and compute time. Microsoft wants your for loop. They don't care what your for loop is written in anymore. We still make .NET because we really like it. It's a really great platform, and we like it a lot, and we think you should use it. But it's totally possible that you would do all of this stuff and then throw the Docker container up in Google Cloud, and Microsoft gets no money. This is truly and completely 100% open source all the way down. The compilers are open source, the command lines, every library. There's no patent promises and secrets. It's just straight open source the way it's supposed to be done, and it's been like that for a couple of years now. This isn't something that just happened last week. The other thing that's interesting, let's go into here. This is in Visual Studio Code. Let's see if I can get rid of these squiggles. We're going to build this real quick. That's not a complicated enough example. Let me find a better one. I made a whole pile of examples beforehand. That one did not initialize. There it is. Okay, so check this out. One of the things that used to be the case with .NET is like the strength of it is the strong typing, right? And I think that we as a computing community have realized the benefits of strong typing while the flexibility of loose typing. And that's why TypeScript is so cool, right? Like TypeScript is what a C programmer wishes JavaScript would do, but it does it in a way that lets you still write regular old JavaScript. So you make a JS file and you just ignore it, and you use TypeScript as a glorified lint tool. Right? Some people think that Intellisense rots the brain, but they're starting to realize that type safety is a useful thing. Now, in the past, Intellisense was this magic thing that you had to pay for. And it was built into Visual Studio, or it was built into tools like ReSharper. You had to go download something from JetBrains to get that. Intellisense is not autocomplete. This is important. Do you have any Sublime people in the room? You know how Sublime sees you typing something and then says, ooh, 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 I know that, and then just does it again for you? So if you just type something and then if you type it again, Sublime's like, yeah, right? That's not Intellisense. I saw it before. Which is cool. It's nice, but it's not intelligent. It's just a convenience, right? If you did it wrong, it's going to be wrong twice. What we've done here, this is Visual Studio Code that I'm in here, okay? Visual Studio Code is written in TypeScript. It's 200,000 lines of TypeScript. It is not Atom. It is not the Atom editor. It has nothing to do with the Atom editor. It is its own thing. I'm going to type var, which says I don't know the type, I equals 0. Now I do know the type. And then I'm going to say I dot. And you can see that instantly it says, oh, here's inty stuff, right? It gives me inty things. Then I'm going to go and say Scott, and I'm going to type I dot, and now I get stringy things. I did that without compiling. I did that without saving the file. Okay? That's powerful. The way that that works, though, is really awesome. And this is an example of like why I'm happy, and one of my kind of like this is why the new Microsoft sucks less than the old Microsoft, is you go to omnisharp.net. This is an open source project that I worked on with a bunch of folks, and they had all the pieces, but they hadn't got together. So we got all the OmniSharp people together, and they said, we like Intellisense. Could we get it working on all of these editors? So what were the pieces? Well, the compiler is open source. It's called Roslyn, R-O-S-L-Y-N. And the Roslyn compiler is a compiler as a service. It's not just something that you call from the command line. You can actually get the abstract syntax tree and look at the tree of the objects and look at the DOM of the code, okay? So what if we externalize that and put it into a service and then make it a web API and then run it on localhost? So then as you're typing, it's going and it's sending the code over to Roslyn, which is dynamically compiling it and then returning the list of things. That's what's happening when you go and type in the editor like that. You see the little flame here, the OmniSharp flame? If you go over to Visual Studio Code, that's the OmniSharp flame. So Intellisense as a service exists. So that means Vim, Sublime, whatever can have that. You want Emacs and you want to have Emacs plus .NET Intellisense, that exists. Isn't that cool? Those things were done without Microsoft. Me and some other guys worked on the side with the team that did OmniSharp and said, this is really cool. And by the time they built it up, the Visual Studio Code said, oh, that's great, let's get involved, right? As opposed to let's destroy it. And they did get involved, and now they're a member of the community. And then you can have things like, if you've seen Project Rider, R-I-D-E-R, this is, takes a second to load up, this is JetBrains' Visual Studio competitor. You can download the early access. They're doing it like every couple of weeks. So this is basically like IntelliJ for .NET. So here is a web application in a complete Visual Studio-like environment with all of the stuff that one likes, the key bindings, the experience, the look and feel of your IntelliJs, or your kind of, if you love JetBrains, then you'll feel comfortable in this. So think about that. In a year and a half, we've gone from not having open source .NET to now we have an open source .NET, and now we have competition in the IDE space that could then provide things that we couldn't provide. So we're kind of trying to compete on a level playing field, if that makes sense, by having all of these pieces be standardized. Okay? So forgive me, I think it's slide time again to bring it all together. Here's where things are going to get a little bit interesting. Okay, how do you like your steak? If you like it well done, you're probably not going to die, right? Because it's gray meat and it's been cooked all to death. So you're not going to get salmonella. You're probably not going to enjoy the meat, but it's not going to kill you. So if you want no risk, you buy Visual Studio or you download Visual Studio. It's free now for open source projects, visualstudio.com/free. And you use NuGet. Anything that's on NuGet, which is again our NPM or our gems, is baked. It's well done and it's supported. So when you call support and you go, hey, what's up? They will be like, cool, which version did you use? Oh yeah, you got that one? Cool, we'll back you up. But you can start trying other things, medium rare. You could build from source. You could do the dev branch. At this point, you're getting into that like warning label on the menu that says, you know, eating uncooked meat could kill you. Because you know why they put that there. Because when you sue them, they're going to go and say, yeah, it was kind of pink, right? Some pink or no pink. You know, lawsuit, no lawsuit. That's what that question is. Right? But we need to support the enterprise. So this is Microsoft's way of trying to support the open source community and the enterprise at the same time. So if you're doing rare meat, that means you're doing feature branches and you're doing your own thing. Now, it turns out that there is a thing that is rarer than rare. Did you know about this? Blue. This is a meat. You can actually, how do you want your meat cooked? Blue. They just slap the cow on the butt and send it out. It's a real thing. Like a good doctor could bring the cow back. That's what blue is. This is third-party forks. Okay? So that means, one of you downloads .NET, you do a git clone, you do a search and replace, you change all the namespace to like Sally.net, and then you ship it. And you go, Sally.net, it's way better, right? I ran ReSharper on it, and it's better now. And then you call support, and you go, hey, what .NET are you using? I'm using Sally.net. I got it from SourceForge. And this really weird toolbar. I don't know where that came from. That would be awesome. Somebody should totally do that just to troll us. That is not going to get supported. But we have people getting .NET running on Raspberry Pis and things like that, and that starts getting interesting. But that's not supported yet. So that's the idea of how that works. Okay? Now, let's go back to the different flavors of .NET. Any Android owners, users? What kind of machine? Do you you know the version number of your Android? Right, so exactly, that's perfect. She says, I don't know the number off the top of my head. It's like KitKat or Juicy Fruit or something, Nougat. Right, so the Android versioning story is so bizarre that they have to name Nougat. I'm pretty sure it's not Nougat. You target an API level. You say, I want to support API level 15, and then that will support all of these Android phones, right? So then you get a new Android phone, and it supports new features and new cool stuff, but then I, the developer, need to use API level 7, and then you'll get the one automatically that does the thing that you want it to do. Make sense? So if you go and do .NET Standard stuff, new string parsing library or the next new action pack or whatever library that you want at your company or your open source project, and you implement a .NET Standard, and it doesn't just run on Windows. It runs in microservices, it runs in Docker, it runs on Alpine Linux, it runs on Xamarin, it runs on an Apple Watch. If it supports .NET Standard, it will run on those small things. That then gets us back to the very, very beginning of the conversation where there are multiple instances of .NET. And they agree to run things based on the .NET standards. So if that theoretical Sally.net fork happens, Sally.net would say, oh, I run on the PlayStation 2, right? Why? Because internet. And then they would say, well, we support .NET Standard 1.2. And then all the .NET Standard library owners would be, awesome. We just now can put PlayStation 2 on our support matrix because we implemented that. There may be other instances of .NET in the future beyond the framework on Windows, the core framework, and Mono. Additionally, there's new stuff that we're coming up with, common infrastructure, that is going to allow us to take .NET in different places where you haven't thought about before. One of the cool ones is a thing called tree trimming. So remember how before we said .NET's scary, it's hundreds of megabytes? Well, the new one is less scary, but now it's a bunch of different kind of packages. So it's kind of this cafeteria plan. What you really want is you want to take your .NET application, you want to pull it up like a tree and have all the dependencies hang off of it, and you want to shake it and have all the functions that you don't use fall away. And then you would get your own private bundled version of .NET, and it might be 100 megs for you, and it might be 250 megs for you because you use more functions. And then you put that on a USB key and bundle it with a runtime, and then I can go and take a USB key and run it on Linux and run it on Mac and run it on Windows. And it has its own private version of .NET, which means that it can't hurt another machine. You don't want to have a situation where I don't want to upgrade .NET on this machine. I'm afraid it'll break stuff. Right? You don't ever want to have an experience like that. Does that make sense? So that dude was like, not for me. See ya. Everything is done in the open. For example, if you go up to .NET on GitHub and look at the language feature status, you can actually see conversations about versions of C# going years in the future. We just are doing C# 7 now, but they're arguing about what new features should go in there, who's going to work on it, who's going to be excited about it. Isn't that cool? So if you're a language geek, you can influence this language that is used by millions of people. Here are some of the cool new features, and then we'll do some Q&A. Some of them are really innovative, and some of them are like, duh. So, like for example, out variables. Here we're saying int xy, and then we say out down here. It's kind of a smelly. Now they can be put on one line. You can just make them when you need them. You can also say that you don't care about ones. You can like literally say out variable, and I just don't care about this. So I'm not even going to give it a name, and you can't even use it because I'm going to discard it as an out parameter, which is kind of cool. But the really hot feature of Windows 7, not Windows 7, C# 7 rather, pardon me, is pattern matching. So you can do stuff like, if is null and if it's an int and things like that, but then stick it in a switch statement, which is kind of ridiculous. But it's one of those things where gross if statements and arrow code just disappear. So you can say switch on a shape. You're checking the type and assigning the variable name all in one line there. So you're saying, well, if it's a circle, then call it C and then do this, and then we do string interpolation, so I don't have to do a string format or any kind of concatenation. I go, oh, it's a shape, it's called C, show me the radius. And what used to be this much code becomes that much code. Isn't that nice? So then you can do really crazy stuff. Is it tuples or tuples? I hear arguments both ways. Tuple sounds like you have a PhD. It sounds fancier. Tuple sounds kind of less classy. I don't know. I'm just going to interchange them while I shush into production. So here's a function that takes a long and then returns 3 strings unnamed. You could go and make a type, temporary type, and put it in there, or you could just return 3 strings. But then you can go and name those 3 strings when you return them, and then someone else can go and refer to those in their usage. So you can avoid those unnecessary extra types. So you basically have a method that returns multiple strings. Now, by default then, you would say .item1 and .item3, which sucks. Those are the default names. What you want is to be able to do this, and then inside the string do this. Now notice that inside that string it went from blue to black, because the Intellisense actually would give you strongly typed Intellisense in the middle of the string. It detects that you've switched into C# and then gives you Intellisense. So you get the ability to return complicated anonymous types that are like structures, and then get Intellisense on them, which is sweet. And then you could even go and say, if you're super lazy, I don't even know what these types are, but I'll just group them all together and say that they're var and you figure it out. And what's nice about that is it feels dynamic, but it's not, right? So you don't have to feel like you're littering all your code with types and stuff like that, okay? Kind of a couple of other ones. This one I have mixed feelings about, but I'm not a language wonk. Local functions. You have a helper function, but you don't really feel like it deserves to be outside of scope. So it's kind of just like a function we just keep kind of between us. So you've got your Fibonacci up here, and then you go and do some stuff, and you say return fib. This function here, that helper function, is here, inside the other function. And then it returns 2 ints. Isn't that weird? But you can see why you do that, right? It's just like, well, it's not really a utils kind of thing. I would, where would it go? It's not really kind of a macro, it's something else. So you can have local functions, which is cool. The other thing I wanted to point out, when I say .NET New, I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to show this, but I want to point out that I can say .NET New, and for many of the defaults, you get F#. So I could say .NET new -- lang F#, and then get an ASP.NET application in F# as well. I think we have enough time for some Q&A, so why don't we grab the microphone and put you to work. And hopefully this provided some value. Anybody any questions, comments? No one called BS in the middle, which was awesome.
So a long time ago, about 10 years ago, I did a Ruby on Rails app, which is probably not really relevant. But basically, it blew up when Service Pack 2 went in on the server. So on this new .NET stuff,
Ruby on Rails blew up because you did something to Windows.
Because service, yeah, that's right.
That's cool.
So now with this new .NET stuff, you do a Service Pack update. Is that going to break anything?
So that's a good question. So when any of these .NET managed code calls a native API, just like when you're in Node and you call a native extension, or if you're in Ruby and you call a native extension, ultimately somebody's going to call some C code. Like that's just the managed life. Some point somebody calls extern C, blah, blah, blah. If that extern C changes, yes, it could break. There's nothing about .NET that changes that. If we, Microsoft, not my department, broke some crypto thing, let's say, could be a mistake, could be a break because we deprecated SHA-1 or something, right? Anyone who called ultimately that C API would be broken. So if we broke your .NET application, we would have also broken any Node, Ruby, Python, whatever applications that also called that same underlying API. Sometimes we can solve that where we will actually statically link stuff, like OpenSSL, statically link it and ship it with the thing. So it wouldn't be broken because ultimately the C code that you're calling is going to be additional open source C code. But if the C code that's being called or the native code that's being called is part of the operating system that is in fact patchable, yes. So the answer is yes, there is a non-zero chance that a Windows update or an apt-get upgrade could break something, but it is trying to be mitigated by being smart about which parts we statically link and which parts we don't. That's about as transparent as I can be. Good question.
Thanks, Scott. To me, I'm hearing a lot of great stuff, but it seems like there are elements of there are strategies to a larger vision, right? So interoperability.
If you think there's a strategy,
source,
that's great.
Open source runs everywhere, but there's a larger vision, right, that this is all driving towards. What is that?
The larger vision is what I said before. Microsoft wants your for loop. Ultimately, they're going to make money on compute. So if you are, like I wrote a blog post a couple of weeks ago on getting Rails to run in Azure. Works great, runs on Linux in Azure. 30% of Azure runs Linux. We want to make Azure a great environment for you to do your work. We want you to like Visual Studio Code, but love Visual Studio and pay money for it. But ultimately, it's the compute time that pays the bills. So you might be an entirely Linux shop, but you like Office 365, and you like it on your phone, so you pay. The strategy is to make people happy. That is, I don't know. There's me, Scott Hunter, John Mont, Julia, Scott. I'm 6 from Satya. So that's the 6 from Satya perspective. Don't quote me on that, but there's no other plan other than make you happy and hopefully you'll pay. And if you don't, then we didn't do a good job and we lost. No. Question right here? Notice how these ones are talking. Y'all are still side-eyeing me after an hour together. I don't know what that's about.
You said standard library function. I have a question about that.
Yeah, sure.
You said if I go for the latest standard library function,
Yeah.
should this be covered by all the legacy?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So if you go and Google with Bing for .NET Standard Library, or with Google, that's cool. This table is, like, that's a fail, and that's too close, but bear with me.
Yep.
If I say it's going to be 1.5, then it supports everything all the way down.
Okay.
The higher the number, the less support I have. So for example, I really need to support Windows 8.1. The last version is 1.2.
Why is that? If I use 2.0, everything has
Because there's stuff that 2.0 does where the underlying C code doesn't exist.
not quite convinced, but
You're not quite convinced? No, it's
I want to go for everything.
it's right there in a table.
Everything has to support.
You want to support everything in the universe? Then you would go and say, I want to support .NET Standard 1.0. And in doing that, exactly as it runs on Android, you would be giving up some API. I might say, well, no tuples, right? Or I might say, no advanced crypto, because there is no advanced crypto on a Silverlight Windows phone.
That's okay, but if I do
Hey, it's okay, you're making a decision, but I want to make sure you're clear. The table is the table,
Yeah,
and this style of API leveling is sacrosanct, and it is well understood outside of the .NET space. So if you decide to pick the lowest common denominator, expect to have fewer functions than if you pick the highest, which is why there is a choice.
Yep.
Good question.
Yep, thank you.
Gentleman right here. I think, did you, blue shirt, did you have a question? No? All right.
So I'm a Java developer, and I could pretty much take like everything that you exercised and figure out what my corollary was.
Cool.
Which is cool. The thing that I was confused about is you had your tests in a separate project, and
Oh, that was just me doing that. You can put them wherever you want to put
for
them.
sake of example.
Yeah, yeah.
So they can live
The
in
issue
with
is
the-
that it's a religious argument. Like, do you ship your tests? Right? Do you, if you have a web application and you have a bunch of tests and then you stick them in production in the same DLL, that's fine. But if you shake the tree, the tests don't get run during production. Therefore, why you have them in your own?
Yeah. Okay.
thing.
But you can live them in the same project.
Do whatever
as
makes
the-
you happy.
Okay.
Yeah. You would be having you'd have a thing that'd be doing double duty. So you type .NET run and it would run, or .NET test and it would test. It depends on which entry point.
Cool.
But yeah, that's not something we typically do. We like to have single responsibility principle. Cool. Question here? Anyone at all on this side would be amazing.
Two questions. First, do you know what implementation of Intellisense Rider decided to use?
I believe they did their own.
Okay.
I believe they're using whatever the one that this is just, and you'd have to ask Hadi Hariri on Twitter, but I believe that like ReSharper sometimes causes problems with Visual Studio because it parses the code itself. They have their own C# parser. Mm-hmm. We believe that Roslyn should be the single source of truth. So when you are running ReSharper on Visual Studio, you have parsed the code twice at all times and held it in memory twice at all times. It is my understanding that they are using their own, but I could be wrong.
Okay. And in your ASP example, I think I noticed that, is there a convergence of MVC and Web API kind of
Yes,
happening?
thank you for noticing that. Okay. Because this is 40 hours of training in 1 hour, I failed to mention that MVC, which was making angle brackets, and Web API, which is making curly braces, is now the same thing. ASP.NET is ASP.NET. It makes, if you return some JSON and someone asked for JSON, it'll return JSON. If it asks for HTML, it'll return HTML, so that they are the same controllers, same base class. Good questions. Yes, people on the other side.
So one of the things that has concerned me with the .NET Core stuff, and maybe things have stabilized a little bit, which is the amount of, it seems like churn in the tooling.
Ton of churn.
And are things to the point, are they stable enough
Yes.
now that we can rely upon things not changing too much out from underneath of us?
Yes, great question. First, things will always change, but the big mess was ASP.NET used a JSON-based project system, and when we didn't know we were buying Xamarin. So the .NET standard strategy, which was always in the back of our minds, became a must-have when 19 new project types dropped on our desk. And it was like, well, either make ASP.NET support XML, or update 19 project types to support JSON. It seemed more obvious to do that. So one of the things that was challenging was that everyone asked us for us to do this in the open, which is like Chipotle, where it's like watching them make the food. But then every once in a while you see something you don't like, and you're like, do I say something? Or like he touched his face and then he touched the meat. Is that my, what is the open source equivalent of like, dude, seriously, wash your hands? That's problematic, right? Those kind of things happen. You all asked us to do it in the open, so we did it in the open, and you did things you didn't like. One of the things that we did is the runtime was baked in 1.0 before the SDK was. So the command line tooling, that .NET Run and .NET Test, just 1.0 like a couple of months ago. Now that it has, I think it's in a good place. This is the year. Now that said, there will be a .NET Core 2.0 this year, and that will ship this. That's this vNext here. But will it break the tooling? Will it fundamentally change? It may change in that right now you have like multiple .NETs that are like local, packaged runtimes where you can go and say, I want a self-contained runtime. We're going to kind of move people more towards the multiple shared runtimes model. It saves disk space. And like you know how Electron's kind of a mess right now because you have 48 versions of Chrome on your machine, one for every program? We want to go kind of more the Adobe Air style, which is like you can have multiple runtimes, but they're all in one place, and then they can get updated and serviced separately. So that might change, but 90% of things are cool, and everything will be either concept or source compatible. So you might have to recompile, but for the most part, yes, this is a good time. 6 months ago was not a good time. Good question. Is that all the time? Is there like another person? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So it's seriously like the really legitimate. All right, I will go outside if you want to hang out, or you can tweet me, and thank you for hanging out.